The morning the world confirmed what I'd spent 11 months preparing for, I was standing in my garage resealing the lid on a 5-gallon bucket of hard red winter wheat with a gamma sill I'd bought in a 2-pack from a preparedness website based out of Provo, Utah. I remember this because the receipt was still taped to the inside of the lid, $31.90 plus shipping. I remember thinking, this is the last normal price I'll ever see on anything. My daughter was upstairs, Cass, 16. She'd been living with me full-time since March, when her mother relocated to Tucson with a boyfriend Cass described once as a man who talks about cryptocurrency like it's a religion, and then never mentioned again. The custody modification was still being processed by a family court that no longer exists. None of that matters now, except that it explains why she was there, in my house, in my prep zone, inside the perimeter I'd spent almost a year building. And why I believed, with the total certainty of a man who has confused preparation with love, that I had already saved her. The first broadcast came through the NOAA weather radio on my kitchen counter at 6:41 a.m., not the emergency alert system. NOAA. That distinction mattered to me at the time because it meant the event had been classified as a public health emergency before it was classified as a civil safety threat. I'd predicted this. I'd written about it on 3 different forums under the handle Palatine Ready, and if you'd scrolled my post history, you'd have found a 9-part thread from the previous October titled, Why the First Signal Will Come Through NOAA, Not EAS, with a detailed breakdown of interagency communication protocols during biological events. I was right. I'd been right for months. The satisfaction of that rightness was the first thing that almost killed us. By 7 o'clock, the television stations were cycling the same 3 pieces of footage. A hospital parking lot in Memphis with people moving wrong. That hitching off-rhythm gait that your brain reads as wounded until you see the mouse. A highway overpass in Northern Virginia where someone had parked sideways across 2 lanes and left both doors open, and the dark shapes milling between the vehicles were shaped like people but weren't walking toward anything. And a cell phone video from what looked like a grocery store shot from above, probably a mezzanine, where a woman in a yellow jacket was being pulled apart by 4 figures who had been standing completely still until she'd passed them. The footage cut before the worst of it. I'd seen worse on the forums. The forums had been ahead by weeks. Cass came downstairs at 7:15 and stood in the kitchen doorway holding her phone in one hand and a bottle of her medication in the other. She took lamotrigine, 100 milligrams once daily for a seizure condition diagnosed when she was 12. I knew this because it was on my list. Her medication was on my list. I had a 14-month supply of it in a labeled bin on shelf C4 in the basement, vacuum sealed in 30-day blister packs I'd repackaged myself. Her doctor's name, the pharmacy, the dosage, the manufacturer, the NDC number, all of it was in a binder I kept in a fireproof document safe behind the water heater. "Dad," she said, "is this it?" I sealed the wheat bucket. I set the gamma lid tool on the workbench beside 3 others identical to it. I looked at my daughter, who was watching me with an expression I now understand was not admiration or confidence or even fear, but the particular resigned patience of a teenager who has spent 8 months watching her father build a monument to anxiety and has just realized the anxiety was justified. "Yeah, Bug," I said. "This is it." I activated the house in 46 minutes. That was 11 minutes faster than my best drill time. Exterior shutters bolted, ground floor windows sealed with pre-cut polycarbonate panels I'd measured and labeled by room. Doors reinforced with bar locks I'd installed in April. Generator tested and switched to propane primary. Water lines closed. Rain catchment routed to the basement filtration unit. Perimeter motion sensors activated. Radio suite powered on. HAM, CB, NOAA, FRS, GMRS, all of it on a rack I'd built from plans I'd modified myself. By 8 o'clock we were sealed. By 8:15 I was in the basement running the closure checklist on a laminated sheet I'd designed to be completed in ink, then photographed, then filed. Everything was where I'd put it. Every system responded. Every seal held. I had prepared for this. I had prepared for exactly this. The world outside was tearing itself open, and I had built the one place it couldn't reach, and my daughter was inside it with me. And I believed, I genuinely believed, that the hard part was over. I need to tell you about the basement because it's where we lived for 23 days, and because the way I built it explains the thing I missed. The house is a 3-bedroom bungalow on a half-acre lot in unincorporated Will County, Illinois, south of Joliet, north of nothing. I bought it in 2019 for the lot size and the full basement, which was poured concrete on 3 sides and block on the 4th. Dry 8-foot ceilings, 1,200 square feet. I spent 11 months converting it. The north wall held the pantry system. 16 wire shelving units, floor to ceiling, organized by category. Grains, legumes, freeze-dried proteins, canned goods, oils and fats, sweeteners, spices, vitamins, and medical. The medical shelf alone held antibiotics. Fish-grade amoxicillin and ciprofloxacin, which are pharmaceutically identical to human prescriptions. A fact I'd verified through published USP data, plus wound care, dental emergency kits, surgical prep packs, tourniquets, and 9 labeled bins of prescription and over-the-counter medications, organized alphabetically by generic name. The east wall was utilities, generator transfer panel, battery bank, charge controllers for the solar array I'd installed on the south-facing roof slope in June, water filtration, and a composting toilet system I'd plumbed myself using a marine unit and a ventilation fan ducted through the existing dryer vent. The south wall was living space. 2 cots, a folding table, a bookshelf, and a partitioned area with a curtain that gave Cass something resembling privacy. I'd included that partition in revision 3 of the floor plan after she moved in. Before March, the basement was designed for one person. I'd adjusted. The west wall was communications, security, and planning. The radio rack, a monitor connected to 4 exterior cameras, a printed county map with evacuation routes, rally points, and supply caches I'd pre-positioned at 2 locations within a 10-mile radius. And the binder system. 7 3-ring binders covering medical protocols, water treatment, food rationing, security procedures, communication schedules, and the master inventory, which I updated weekly. Everything was labeled. Everything had a backup. Everything had a contingency written in my handwriting on laminated cardstock filed in the correct binder. Cass sat on her cot that first morning and watched me run the post-seal checklist, and she said, "You're happy." I wasn't. That's what I told her, and I believed it. But she was right. Not happy. Vindicated. There is a difference, but it's narrower than I thought, and from the outside it looks identical. I moved through the basement that morning with a fluency I'd never felt anywhere else. Every object was where I'd placed it. Every system was one I understood. The chaos outside, the screaming that the cameras picked up before 9 a.m., the shapes moving across the yard by noon, all of it was separated from us by concrete and preparation, and the 11 months I'd spent becoming ready. What I didn't notice that first day, what I wouldn't notice for 17 more, was the look on Cass's face when she opened her medication bottle that evening and shook 1 tablet into her palm. She counted them. I saw her do it. I assumed she was being responsible. She was counting for a different reason. By the end of the first week, the exterior cameras showed a world that no longer resembled the one I'd sealed us from. The street was empty of living traffic. 2 houses on our block had burned. The Kowalski place and the rental on the corner. And the smoke had drifted south for 3 days before the structures consumed themselves and went quiet. The dead moved through at irregular intervals. Sometimes 1, sometimes clusters of 4 or 5, drawn by sounds I couldn't always identify. They were slower than the form predictions had suggested, more persistent. They didn't tire and they didn't leave voluntarily. Once drawn to a stimulus, they'd stand near it for hours, swaying, mouths working, until something else pulled them. I cataloged their behavior in a dedicated notebook. I thought it might be useful later. The neighbor to our east. Frank Reeves, 63, retired pipe fitter, diabetic, had knocked on our door the second afternoon. I watched him on the camera. He was carrying a plastic bag from Walgreens and wearing a jacket that wasn't warm enough. He knocked for 4 minutes. He called my name. He said he knew I was in there. He said he'd seen me installing the shutters. He said his insulin was in a refrigerator that had lost power. I didn't answer. Cass was sitting at the folding table eating rehydrated black bean soup when Frank knocked, and she looked at the monitor and looked at me and said, "Dad." "We talked about this," I said. "He's a person. Every person we let in changes the math. Air, water, calories, medical. Every variable shifts. I calculated capacity for two, comfortable capacity for two. He's standing right there. I know. He's going to die. A lot of people are going to die. That's what this is. We prepared. He didn't." She set down her spoon. She stared at me with her mother's eyes, and I saw the precise moment she decided not to argue, which I mistook for agreement. It wasn't. It was something harder. It was a 16-year-old girl watching her father choose math over mercy and recognizing that the math was correct and the mercy would have been too, and that her father had built a world where only one of those things fit. Frank left. I watched him on the camera cross back into his yard and go into his house and close the door. On the fourth day, I saw him through his kitchen window, moving slowly. On the sixth day, the window was dark. On the ninth day, 3 of the dead broke through his back door. I heard the sound through the concrete. Cass was asleep, or pretending to be. I noted it in my log. Day 9, Reeves residence breached. 3 infected entered via rear door. No further activity observed. I didn't write what I felt. I didn't feel what I should have. Both of those facts are on me, and I've stopped trying to separate them. By day 12, the routine was load-bearing. That's the only way to describe what structure did for us in the basement. Every hour had a purpose. Morning, systems check battery levels, water filter pressure, generator fuel gauge, camera review. Mid-morning, inventory rotation and meal preparation. Afternoon, radio monitoring on 3 bands, with a dedicated 90-minute window for ham transmission and listening. Evening, situation log, meal, and decompression. I followed this schedule exactly. Cass followed it approximately. She read. She'd brought 9 books downstairs on the first morning and stacked them beside her cot without being asked. Paperbacks, mostly, some of them school assignments she'd never finished. One that had a library barcode on the spine. She read slowly and completely and then reread them. She didn't complain about the food. She didn't complain about the toilet. She didn't complain about the concrete walls or the hum of the filtration pump or the LED panels I'd installed that produced a flat, shadowless light that made everything look like a hospital corridor. What she did was get quieter. I interpreted this as adaptation. The forums called it bunker settling. The psychological adjustment period during which the mind recalibrates to reduce stimulation in confined space. I'd prepared for it. I'd included the book cards, a journal I'd bought for her at Target in August. I'd even printed a packet of logic puzzles and crosswords, which she'd looked at once, smiled at in a way I didn't understand, and set on the shelf. What I did not prepare for, because it existed outside my model, was the possibility that her quietness was not adaptation, but management. She was managing me. She was modulating her behavior to avoid triggering my anxiety, which she had learned. Through 8 months of living in a house organized around the premise that the world was ending, to read with a precision I didn't know she had. When I checked the cameras obsessively, she didn't comment. When I recounted the water reserves for the 3rd time in a day, she handed me the clipboard. When I woke at 2 a.m. and sat at the radio rack scanning frequencies, she didn't ask me to come back to bed. She made room for the ritual because she understood, in a way I didn't, that the ritual was holding me together. She was parenting me. I was so busy saving her that I never saw it. On day 14, I noticed the first thing that didn't fit my model, and I dismissed it. I was reviewing the master inventory. Weekly protocol, laminated checklists, and I reached the medical shelf and counted the lamotrigine. The bin was labeled. The blister packs were stacked in order by month. I counted 14 months of supply, which is what should have been there. But the open pack, the current month, had fewer tablets missing than it should have. I recounted. I checked my log. She'd been in the basement for 14 days. 14 tablets should have been consumed. 11 were gone. 3-day discrepancy. I wrote it in the margin of the inventory sheet with a small question mark and moved on. I assumed I'd miscounted during the initial packaging. I assumed the error was mine. It was not mine. The radio was both a lifeline and a wound. On the ham bands, I could hear other survivors. Scattered, frightened, sometimes organized. A group in Kankakee had secured a grain elevator and was broadcasting water purification instructions every 6 hours. A woman in Peoria transmitted a children's story time every evening at 7, reading picture books into a microphone for anyone listening. And the sound of her voice reading Goodnight Moon in the middle of a dead world was the only thing that made Cass cry in the first 2 weeks. On day 15, I made contact with a man who identified himself as Marcus, operating from a veterinary clinic outside. He'd fortified the building with cattle panels and was treating survivors with animal medications. The same pharmaceutical equivalency I documented in my own medical binder. We talked for 40 minutes. He was calm, knowledgeable, direct. He asked about our supplies. I gave him generalities. He gave me specifics. He had 18 people in his clinic. 3 of them were children under 10. 2 were diabetic. Insulin's the bottleneck, Marcus said. Everything else I can substitute or ration. Insulin I can't manufacture and I can't approximate. When it's gone, it's gone. What's your supply? I asked. Maybe 30 days at current dosing, less if more diabetics show up, and they will because we're the only clinic broadcasting on this band. I sat with the headphones on for a long time after Marcus signed off. I thought about Frank Reeves. I thought about his Walgreens bag and his jacket that wasn't warm enough. I thought about the fact that I had, in my medical inventory, a comprehensive shelf of antibiotics, antivirals, analgesics, anti-inflammatories, antihistamines, antifungals, antidiarrheals, and 14 months of anticonvulsant medication and 0 insulin. Because no one in my household was diabetic, and my model was built for my household. My model was always built for my household. That was the thought I should have held. That was the thread that, if I'd pulled it, would have unraveled everything 11 weeks earlier and saved my daughter from what I was about to put her through. My model was built for the people inside it, and I had spent so long perfecting the model that I'd stopped looking at the people. But I didn't pull the thread. I logged the radio contact, noted Marcus's frequency and location on the county map, and moved on to the evening meal. Cass was sitting on her cot reading a paperback called The Secret History by Donna Tartt. She'd read it twice already. She was holding it in her left hand. Her right hand was resting on her knee and it was trembling, very slightly in a way I did not see because I was looking at the inventory sheet. Day 17 is when the perimeter was tested. I'd designed the exterior approach to be unappealing. No visible light leakage, no audible generator noise above 40 decibels at the property line, no indication of habitation. The shutters were painted the same color as the siding. The polycarbonate window panels were backed with blackout fabric. From the street, the house looked abandoned, possibly already looted. But the dead don't read architecture. They read sound, motion, and maybe scent. The forums debated scent endlessly and never reached consensus. At 3:20 a.m. on day 17, the east-facing camera picked up a group of 9 moving along the tree line at the back of the lot. They were heading south in that loosely coordinated drift pattern I'd been documenting, following something I couldn't see or hear. Then the generator cycled. It was a normal cycle. The propane unit ran at variable load and periodically adjusted its output. The sound was brief, 42 decibels at 5 meters, well within my design tolerance. The group stopped. I was awake. I was always awake at 3 a.m. by then. I watched them on the monitor. 9 figures standing at the edge of the yard in the green-gray wash of the infrared camera, heads tilting in that bird-like motion I'd come to associate with auditory processing. They stood there for 11 minutes. Then 3 of them began walking toward the house. I woke Cass. She came awake fast and clean, no confusion, no questions. She looked at the monitor and her jaw tightened, and she reached under her cot and pulled on her boots without being told. I drilled this. We'd rehearsed the breach protocol 4 times. She knew where to stand, what to hold, what to do if the upper door failed. The 3 reached the house. One pressed against the garage door and stayed there, mouth working against the steel. The second circled to the north side and found the basement window well. which was sealed with a welded steel grate and a polycarbonate panel behind it. It pressed against the grate. The sound transmitted through the block wall. A low, rhythmic thudding, like a fist wrapped in wet cloth. The third found the front door. The reinforced front door, with its 3-bar locks and steel core frame, held without flexion. The thing outside hit it repeatedly with what sounded like its shoulder, or its head, or both. The rhythm was irregular. It would strike 3 or 4 times quickly, then pause, then strike again. It did this for 90 minutes. Cass sat on her cot with her boots on, and her hands pressed flat on her knees, and she didn't speak. I stood at the monitor and tracked all 9. The 3 at the house, the 6 still at the tree line. The 6 did not approach. They stood and swayed and watched with whatever passed for watching. At 5:04 a.m., the 3 at the house disengaged. I don't know why. There was no new stimulus. They simply stopped and drifted south, rejoining the others, and the group moved on. I noted the event. I cataloged the behavior. I reviewed the generator noise profile and identified a modification that would reduce the cycling sound by an estimated 6 decibels. Cass went back to bed. She turned toward the wall and pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and I heard her breathing go flat and deliberate in the way a person breathes when they are controlling their body because they cannot control anything else. I should have sat with her. I should have put down the clipboard and the checklist and the noise modification notes and sat on the edge of her cot and been her father instead of her engineer. I didn't. I went back to the radio rack. There was always something to monitor. On day 19, I found the second discrepancy in the lamotrigine count, and this time I couldn't dismiss it. I was running the weekly medical inventory, a protocol I designed to take 45 minutes in which I performed with a pencil and the laminated master sheet and a handheld calculator, because redundancy meant analog. I opened the medication bin, removed the current blister pack, and counted the empty cells. 19 days. 19 tablets should have been consumed. 15 were gone. A 4-day gap. The gap was growing. I stood in the basement holding the blister pack under the LED panel, and I felt something move in my chest that wasn't fear. It was something older and worse. It was the sensation of a model failing. The specific vertigo of a man who has built a closed system encountering a variable he cannot account for. I went to Cass. She was at the folding table writing in the journal I'd bought her, and she closed it when she saw me coming, which I noticed and filed and did not remark on. Bug, I need to check your medication. It's fine. I'm showing a discrepancy in the count. Can I see your bottle? She had a personal bottle. The one she'd brought downstairs on day 1, the one from the upstairs bathroom. Her regular pharmacy bottle. The basement supply was backup. The protocol was that she'd use her personal supply first, then transition to the prepackaged reserves. She handed me the bottle. I opened it. I counted. The bottle should have been empty by day 14 at 1 tablet per day. It was not empty. It contained 11 tablets. Cass, I've been taking them. There are 11 pills in this bottle. I've been taking them. Maybe I miscounted. You've missed at least 4 doses from the backup supply, and you have 11 remaining in your personal bottle. That's 15 missed doses in 19 days. She looked at me. Not at the bottle. At me. She looked at me with an expression I've spent every day since trying to decode, and the closest I can get is this. She looked like someone who had been caught, but not in a lie. Caught in a sacrifice she never intended me to see. Why? I said. Dad, why are you skipping doses? Because we might need them. We have 14 months of mine. We have 14 months of one medication for one person. And you built this for, you said it yourself. You calculated for 2 people. What if one of us needs something you didn't stock? What if we're down here longer than 14 months? What if the supply chain doesn't come back? That's not how your medication works. You can't stockpile it by skipping doses. The therapeutic effect depends on consistent blood levels. If you drop below, I know. Do you? Do you know what happens if you have a seizure down here? I've read the binder, Dad. Section M-4, seizure protocol. Protect the head, clear the area, time the event, Do not restrain. Administer rescue medication if available. You have it in the red kit on shelf C2. I know exactly where it is. She recited my own protocol back to me with a fluency that made my stomach drop because it meant she'd studied it. She had studied the seizure protocol not as a precaution, but as a contingency for a plan she was already executing. A plan to stretch her own medication by skipping doses, accepting the risk of seizure, in service of a preparedness logic she had learned from living with me. She had become me. She had absorbed the philosophy of scarcity and rationing and calculated self-denial that I had built this entire basement around. And she had applied it to her own body, and I hadn't seen it because I was counting the blister packs and not looking at my daughter. You're going to take your medication, I said, every day, full dose, starting now. I have been taking, Cass, every day. She looked at the bottle. She looked at me. She picked up one tablet and swallowed it dry without water. The gesture was compliant and empty, and I recognized it as the motion of a child who has learned that obedience is faster than argument in a house where one person controls all the systems. I went back to the medical shelf and I recounted everything, and I updated the inventory, and I noted the discrepancy in the correction in the adjusted timeline in the binder. And I felt, for the first time in 19 days, the structural groan of something failing inside the model that I could not fix with a checklist. That night I couldn't sleep, and I sat at the radio rack and I didn't scan frequencies. I sat in the dark with the headphones around my neck, and I looked at the monitors showing the empty yard, and I tried to locate the moment I had stopped being a father and started being a system. I couldn't find it. That was the problem. There was no single moment. It was gradient, like boiling a frog, except I was both the frog and the water and the hand adjusting the flame. Every purchase, every list, every laminated card, every drill, every shelf label, every forum post, every sealed bucket of winter wheat. Each one was rational in isolation. Each one was a small, defensible act of love dressed in the language of logistics. I was protecting my daughter. I was ensuring her survival. Every object in this basement existed because I cared about her continued existence on this earth. And the sum total of those objects had created an environment in which she had logically concluded that the best thing she could do for our survival was to quietly damage her own health. I thought about Frank Reeves, not his death. I'd already processed that, or convinced myself I had. I thought about the Walgreens bag. I thought about what was in it. Insulin, probably. His own medication. He'd walked to a pharmacy on the second day of the apocalypse and collected his prescription, and then walked to my door and asked to be let in. And I'd watched him on a camera and done the math, and the math said no. The math always said no. The math was designed to say no. I had built a model in which the correct answer to every human variable was exclusion, because inclusion was a threat to the system, and the system was how I expressed love. I pulled out the county map and looked at the locations I'd marked. My two pre-positioned supply caches, Marcus's veterinary clinic in Wilmington, the grain elevator group in Kankakee, and Frank Reeves's house, 38 feet from my east wall, dark on the cameras for 10 days now. I'd never searched his house. The thought had never crossed the threshold of my planning because Frank's house was outside the perimeter, and the perimeter was sacred. But Frank was a diabetic who had walked to Walgreens on day 2 and come home with a bag of supplies. Frank, who had no one else in the house. Frank, whose insulin was in a refrigerator that had lost power. Insulin, unrefrigerated, degrades. But it doesn't become useless immediately. In stable temperatures, below 80 degrees, it can retain efficacy for 28 to 30 days. The forums had discussed this. I'd read the threads. I'd never bookmarked them because insulin wasn't in my model. 28 days. We were on day 19. I didn't need insulin. Nobody in my basement needed insulin. But Marcus had 18 people and a 30-day supply and a bottleneck that would start killing people in a month. And Frank's refrigerator was 38 feet away. And the medication in it had maybe 9 days of residual efficacy. And I was sitting in a basement full of preparations for every contingency except the one that required me to help someone I couldn't see. I didn't act on this thought. Not yet. I logged it. I wrote it on a fresh sheet of paper and clipped it to the inside cover of the situation binder, and I labeled it contingency, external medical recovery, and I went back to bed. Even my generosity needed a filing system. On day 21, Cass had a seizure. I was at the radio rack. She was on her cot. The sound was what reached me first. Not a scream, not a word, but a dense, percussive exhalation, followed by a rhythmic impact that I identified in less than a second as a human skull striking a concrete wall. I was beside her in 4 steps. She was on her side. The cot had no railing and she'd wedged herself against the wall, which was the worst possible position because every tonic contraction drove her head into the block. I pulled the cot away from the wall. I got the folded blanket behind her head. I timed the event on my watch. 2 minutes and 41 seconds of generalized tonic-clonic seizure in a 16-year-old girl in a concrete basement 8 feet underground, and I knelt beside her and held the blanket behind her head and counted the seconds, and I was useless. Completely, structurally, definitionally useless. Every system I'd built, every shelf I'd labeled, every protocol I'd laminated, none of it could reach inside her body and stop what was happening. When it ended, she was postictal for 38 minutes. That's the recovery phase. Confusion, exhaustion, sometimes aggression or fear. Cass was none of those things. She was silent. She lay on her side with her eyes half open and her breathing shallow and her right hand opening and closing slowly. And she looked at me without recognition for the first 12 minutes, and then with recognition and something worse for the remaining 26. She knew what had happened. She knew why. When she could speak, the first thing she said was, "Don't say it. You skipped doses. I took them. You watched me. You took them for 2 days after I caught the discrepancy. Before that, you'd missed 15. Your blood levels dropped below the therapeutic threshold, and this is the result. This is exactly the result. I know. You could have died. You could have status epilepticus. You could have aspirated. You could have." "I know, Dad. I read the binder." She tried to sit up, and I put my hand on her shoulder and she flinched. Not from pain, but from the weight of being touched by the person who had built the environment that convinced her this was logical. I felt the flinch in my entire body. I still feel it. I administered the rescue medication from the red kit on shelf C2. Lorazepam, 2 milligrams, sublingual. Her breathing stabilized. Her color improved. I checked her pupils, her pulse, her oral cavity for blood. I did this competently and thoroughly because I had prepared for it, and the competence was as empty as anything I've ever felt in my life. She slept for 6 hours. I sat beside her cot for all 6. I didn't check the cameras. I didn't scan the radio. I didn't update the inventory or the situation log or any of the 7 binders that documented the perfect functioning of a system that had just put my daughter on the floor. At some point during those 6 hours, I looked at the basement. I looked at it not as its architect, but as its inhabitant. And what I saw was a concrete room full of objects organized by a man who had confused control for safety and preparation for love. And at the center of it, on a cot I'd bought from a camping supply website for $69, was the one variable I'd never modeled correctly. A living girl who had tried to optimize herself the way I'd optimized everything else and whose body had refused. I was the critical detail I'd missed. Not a supply, not a system, not an overlooked item on a shelf. Me. My orientation toward the world. The assumption, buried so deep I'd never examined it, that survival was an engineering problem and that the correct number of laminated checklists could substitute for the terrifying, uncontrollable, unschedulable act of being present for another human being. She woke up and I was still there. That surprised her. I could see it. The micro adjustment in her expression when she registered that I was sitting in the same position, that the clipboard was not in my hands, that no checklist had been completed in 6 hours. She looked at me like I was a new variable. "How do you feel?" I said. "Like I got hit by a bus made of electricity." "That's medically consistent." She almost smiled. Almost. It collapsed before it reached her eyes, and what replaced it was something I'd been failing to read for weeks. The exhaustion of a person who has been performing stability for someone else's benefit. Dad, I need to tell you something. Okay. I wasn't just stretching the medication. I was. I had a system. She swallowed. I was alternating. One day full dose, one day half, one day skip. 3-day rotation. I calculated that it would extend the supply by 47%. 44, I used different rounding. She had built a rationing model. My 16-year-old daughter, in the margins of the journal I'd bought her at Target, had constructed a medication reduction schedule with a rotation pattern and projected extension timeline. And she had executed it for 17 days without telling me, because telling me would have introduced a variable she couldn't control. My reaction. And she had learned from living in my house that uncontrolled variables were the enemy. Can I see the journal? I asked. She hesitated. Then she reached under her pillow and handed it to me. The first 8 pages were what I'd expected. Sparse daily entries, weather observations from the cameras, a running list of books read with small notations. The kind of journaling a quiet teenager does when given a book and nothing else to do. Page 9 was the medication schedule. Page 10 was a calorie tracking chart she'd built by reading my own food rationing binder and applying the same methodology to herself. She'd been voluntarily undereating by roughly 200 calories per day, redistributing the surplus to me by serving slightly larger portions at my meals and slightly smaller at hers. The differential was invisible. I hadn't noticed. Page 11 stopped me. It was a list titled, "If I Have a Seizure." Below the title in her neat handwriting were instructions for me, not medical instructions. I had those laminated on the wall. These were emotional instructions. Don't blame yourself. Don't change the system. The system works. Don't open the door because of me. The math is right. I just rounded wrong. I love you. I wasn't trying to be a problem. I closed the journal. I set it on the table. I put both hands flat on my knees because they were shaking, and I didn't want her to see, but she saw, because she always saw, because she'd been watching me with the same meticulous attention I gave the inventory and the cameras and the radio, except she did it out of love, and I did it out of fear. And the difference between those two things is the entire distance between who I was and who I should have been. You are not a problem, I said. You were never a problem. You were never a variable. You are my daughter, and I have been. I've been wrong about a lot of this, about how to do this. The basement works, Dad. The basement works. I don't, not the way I've been working. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Are you going to open the door?" Not should we, not can we. She asked whether I was going to, because she understood that the door was my identity, not just our security. To open it was to admit that the sealed system was insufficient, that the model was incomplete, that the 11 months I'd spent building this place had produced a structure that was survivable and airless in every sense that mattered. I'm thinking about it, I said. Frank had insulin in his fridge, she said. I looked at her. I heard you on the radio with Marcus, she said. The walls aren't that thick, Dad. I've heard everything. On the morning of day 22, I opened the door. I stood at the base of the stairs with the laminated breach protocol in one hand and a pry bar in the other, and I looked at the steel core door I'd installed in April and reinforced in June and drilled against in July and sealed on the morning of day 1, and I understood that walking through it was not a tactical decision. It was a confession. It was the admission that my closed system required the world I'd sealed it against. Cass was on her cot, still recovering. I'd restored her full medication schedule. No rationing, no rotation, no optimization. 100 milligrams every morning, full stop. She'd taken the morning dose while I watched, swallowing it with water this time, and the normalcy of the gesture nearly broke me. I'm going to Frank's house, I said. I'm going to check for insulin. If it's there, I'm going to contact Marcus and arrange a transfer. Okay. I'll be exposed for maybe 10 minutes. I need you to watch the cameras and keep the interior door locked until I signal. I know the protocol. I know you know the protocol. I'm telling you because I want to talk to you, not because I think you need instructions. She blinked. Something shifted in her face. A loosening, a fractional release of a tension she'd been holding so continuously that its absence looked like surprise. Okay, she said. Be careful. I unlocked the 3-bar locks. I opened the steel core door. I climbed the stairs to the main floor for the first time in 22 days, and the smell hit me before the light. The house smelled like a house that had been sealed for 3 weeks. Stale air, dust, the faint chemical odor of the polycarbonate panels off-gassing in rooms that hadn't been ventilated. The main floor was untouched. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The wheat bucket was still on the workbench. The gamma lid tool was where I'd set it down. I went to the back door. I checked the cameras from the upstairs monitor. Cass would be watching the same feeds below. The yard was clear. The tree line was clear. Frank's house was 38 feet east, dark, the back door still breached from day 9. I opened the back door and stepped outside, and the air hit me like a hand. Late October in Will County, the sky was gray and enormous, and the trees had turned, and the leaves were on the ground, and the world smelled like wood smoke and cold and decomposition and rain, and I stood on my back step for 8 seconds breathing it because I had forgotten, genuinely forgotten, that the world had texture. I crossed the yard at a measured pace, not running. Running draws attention. I entered Frank's yard through the gap in the fence he'd never repaired, and I'd never offered to help with. The back door was open, the frame was splintered, inside the kitchen was dark, and the smell was immediate and specific, and I will not describe it except to say that Frank Reeves had died in his kitchen, probably on day 6 or 7, and the dead had not come for him because he was alive. They had come because the door was weak and the sound carried. I found him in the hallway. I stepped past him. I went to the kitchen. The refrigerator was a standard residential unit, door closed, power dead. I opened it. The interior was warm and dark and the food had turned, but on the top shelf in a clear plastic bag from Walgreens were 4 boxes of insulin pens, Humalog. The boxes were unopened. He'd collected them and brought them home and knocked on my door, and then he'd sat in his house and waited and died, and the medications sat on the shelf of a dead refrigerator at ambient temperature for. I checked my watch, did the math, 22 days, 28 to 30 days at room temperature. The insulin was still viable, barely, maybe 6 to 8 days of remaining efficacy, depending on how warm the house had gotten during the fires. I took all 4 boxes. I walked back across the yard and through the fence gap and into my house, and I locked the door, and I went downstairs and I set the boxes on the table, and Cass looked at them and looked at me and said, "You went through his house?" "Yes." "Was he there?" "Yes." She didn't ask anything else. She didn't need to. I sat at the radio rack and hailed Marcus on his frequency, and it took 4 tries over 2 hours before he responded. And when I told him what I had, his voice changed in a way I'd never heard on a radio before, a frequency of relief so raw it sounded like pain. Marcus arrived on day 23 with 2 people I'd never met. A woman named Dana who drove the truck, and a man named Thomas who carried a rifle with the casual competence of someone who'd been carrying it for weeks, not months. They pulled up to the front of the house in a white veterinary service pickup with cattle panels welded to the bed, and I watched them on the camera for 6 full minutes before I went upstairs. Old habits. Some of them are worth keeping. I opened the front door. Marcus was shorter than his voice. Thin, mid-50s, gray beard, glasses held together with medical tape at the bridge. He looked at my house. The shutters, the sealed windows, the reinforced door, and his expression cycled through something I recognized. Professional assessment followed by an opinion he chose not to voice. "You're the prepper," he said. "I prepared, yes." "Same thing." He looked past me into the house. "You said 4 boxes of Humalog, unopened. Top shelf of a dead fridge for 22 days. Ambient temperature. I'd estimate 6 to 8 days of efficacy remaining. Maybe less. I'll take it. Even degraded, it buys time. Time is all we're buying right now." He studied me. "What do you want for it?" The question landed in a place I wasn't expecting. Not because it was unfair. In this economy, in this world, everything was transactional, and I understood that. It landed because I had spent 22 days inside a system designed to eliminate exactly this kind of exchange, and the system had failed. And I was standing in my doorway holding insulin I'd recovered from a dead man's kitchen because my daughter had a seizure, and the seizure had broken something in my architecture that needed breaking. Nothing, I said. Marcus tilted his head. Same bird-like assessment the dead did, except his eyes were sharp and alive and skeptical. Nothing, he repeated. It's not mine. It belonged to my neighbor. He's dead. He would have wanted it used. You didn't answer my question. I asked what you want. I stood in the doorway and I looked at Marcus, and I said something I had not planned to say and had not written in any binder or on any laminated card. I said, I want you to tell me what I'm doing wrong. He stared at me for 5 seconds. Then he said, invite me in and I'll tell you. I let him in. I let Dana and Thomas in. I let 3 strangers into the house I'd sealed against strangers. And Cass came upstairs for the first time in 22 days, and the sound she made when the daylight hit her face. A small, involuntary intake of breath, like someone surfacing, was the sound of my failure, and I heard it clearly. Marcus walked through the basement in 11 minutes. He didn't touch anything. He read the shelf labels and the binder spines and the laminated protocols on the wall, and he looked at the 2 cots and the partition curtain and the folding table and the journal Cass had left open on her pillow. You built this for a siege, he said. I built it for survival. Same thing, in your head. That's the problem. He pointed at the shelving. You've got 14 months of food, 12 months of water treatment capacity, medical supplies for a small clinic, communications, power, filtration, sanitation. You built all of this? Over 11 months. It's good work. Seriously, the engineering is thoughtful. The inventory management is better than mine, and I'm a licensed practitioner. He turned to face me. But you built a submarine. You built a closed system that doesn't exchange anything with the outside. No resources out, no people in, no information that doesn't come through a radio you control. That was the design. I know, and it almost killed your kid. The words hit the concrete walls and didn't echo because concrete absorbs sound. It just holds it. Cass was sitting on the stairs behind us. I don't know how much she heard. I know she heard that. A submarine works, Marcus said, if you're a submarine. If you're a house with a kid in it, you need doors that open. You need to exchange things, resources, labor, information, trust, especially trust. Trust is the only supply chain that doesn't degrade on a shelf. Marcus took the insulin. Dana and Thomas loaded it into a cooler with ice packs from my freezer. The last of the ice, which had been slowly losing its utility since the grid went down, in which I surrendered without counting or logging, and the act of not counting felt like putting down something heavy that I'd been carrying in both hands for a year. Before they left, Marcus sat at my folding table and drew a map on the back of a sheet from my situation log. He drew his clinic. He drew the grain elevator in Kankakee. He drew 4 other positions I hadn't known about. A church in Braidwood that was running a nursery, a water treatment plant in Coal City that a retired engineer had reactivated, a farmstead near Dwight that was producing food, and a school in Morris where a group of teachers had organized a supply depot and communications hub. There's a network, he said. It's not formal, it's not military. It's just people who figured out what you haven't yet, which is that a closed system is a tomb with better shelving. He wrote his frequency on the corner of the map. He wrote 5 others. Your kid needs a doctor, he said. Not a binder. An actual doctor who can examine her and adjust her medication and monitor her blood levels and talk to her about what she's been through. I have a physician's assistant in my clinic who was a neurologist office nurse for 12 years. Her name's Patricia. She's good. I can't move, Cass. You can. You've been telling yourself you can't because moving her means leaving the basement. And leaving the basement means the basement wasn't enough. And if the basement wasn't enough, then the 11 months you spent building it were. I know what they were. He looked at me steadily. Do you? I didn't answer. He didn't push. He shook my hand and he shook Cass's hand, and he walked out the front door and got in the truck, and they drove north. And I stood in the doorway and watched them until the truck was out of sight. And the street was empty, and the sky was gray, and the air smelled like October and decay and distance. Cass stood beside me in the doorway. She hadn't been outside in 22 days. She stood there with her hand on the doorframe and the cold air on her face, and she breathed, and I watched her breathe, and I understood that this. Her face in open air, her lungs filling with something I hadn't filtered, was the thing I should have been preparing for. "Are we going?" she said. "I don't know." Liar. I looked at her. She was smiling. Not a big smile, a small, careful, provisional smile. The kind you give someone who has been wrong about a "we left on day 24. Not at dawn. I'd planned for dawn because every evacuation scenario I'd ever modeled began at first light for maximum visibility and travel time. But Cass wasn't ready at dawn. She was sitting on her cot at 5:45 a.m. with her boots on and her hands in her lap, staring at the basement like someone trying to memorize a room she'd lived in for over 3 weeks but had never chosen. "We can wait," I said. "No, I just want to look at it." So I stood at the base of the stairs and I let her look. And I looked too. The shelves, the bins, the labels. My handwriting on every one. Block letters, permanent marker, each one placed at precisely the same height so the eye could scan the row without adjusting. The binders in their rack, spines out, color-coded. The LED panels casting that flat clinical light. The composting toilet behind its marine-grade partition. The folding table where we'd eaten 46 meals across from each other without ever once having a conversation that wasn't about systems, schedules, or supplies. Until the last 3 days, when the conversations became about everything else, stumbling and graceless, and more nourishing than any freeze-dried meal I'd ever rehydrated. The radio rack, where I'd spent more hours than I'd spent sitting with her. The cot where she'd seized, with the blanket still bunched against the wall where I'd shoved it behind her head. The red kit on shelf C2, still open from where I'd pulled the lorazepam. I packed a single bag for each of us. Not the 72-hour kits I'd pre-assembled and drilled with. Those weighed 46 pounds each and included fire-starting redundancies, water purification tablets in 3 different chemical families, a folding saw, a Faraday-caged backup radio, and laminated cards listing edible plants of the upper Midwest that neither of us could have identified in the field. I left them on the shelf. I packed clothes, her full medication supply unrationed, unoptimized, every tablet accounted for. Water, food for 3 days, the handheld radio, and the county map with Marcus's hand-drawn annotations. I left the rest. 14 months of food in labeled bins on wire shelving I'd assembled with my own hands over a weekend in May. 12 months of water treatment capacity, the antibiotics, the wound care kits, the dental emergency supplies, the 7 binders, the laminated protocols, the master inventory sheet with its weekly check marks and marginal notations, including the small question mark beside the Lamotrigine count from day 14 that should have told me everything and told me nothing because I was reading numbers instead of my daughter. I left the generator running on low output, propane valve open, battery bank charged, solar array still feeding the charge controller on the roof. The basement would sustain itself for months without a human in it, which was either a testament to good engineering or an indictment of what I'd valued. And I'd stopped trying to separate those two things. I didn't lock the basement door. I didn't lock the front door. I didn't engage the bar locks or the steel core reinforcement or any of the mechanisms I'd installed to keep the world out. I left every door in the house the way Marcus's clinic sign suggested to open. On the folding table, I placed a legal pad. On it, I'd written, in the same block letters I used for every label in the basement, a complete guide, not a protocol, not a restricted document, a gift. Every shelf cataloged, every system explained in plain language, how to start the generator, how to switch fuel sources, how to operate the water filtration, how to read the battery monitor, how to find the medical supplies and what each one did. I wrote dosage information. I wrote the radio frequencies Marcus had given me, and the 5 others from the network. I wrote the locations of the 2 supply caches I'd prepositioned, with GPS coordinates and physical descriptions of the landmarks. At the bottom of the last page I wrote, "This was built for 2 people, but it works for more. The math changes. Let it." It was the most useful thing I'd ever written. It was addressed to no one. It was the first document I'd produced in 11 months that existed to help a stranger rather than exclude one. Cass carried her 9 paperbacks in a tote bag slung over her shoulder. She carried the library book. The Perks of Being a Wallflower, with the Joliet Public Library barcode on the spine, checked out on a date stamped 6 weeks before the world ended, from a building that no longer functioned as anything. I asked her why she was bringing it. "Because it's not mine," she said. I looked at her. She looked back at me with an expression that contained no irony and no performance, just the simple, radical conviction that borrowed things get returned, even when the institution that loaned them has collapsed, even when the due date has lost all meaning, even when carrying it costs weight and space in a bag that could hold something more immediately useful. She was carrying an obligation to a world that might not exist anymore, and she was carrying it because the obligation was the point. I almost said something about weight limits and practical prioritization. I caught myself. I picked up my bag and walked upstairs and held the front door open, and she walked through it into gray October daylight, and I followed her out. We drove north in my truck along Route 53. The roads were passable but narrated. Every mile told a piece of a story I'd missed from the basement. Abandoned vehicles clustered at intersections where traffic had gridlocked and people had fled on foot. A gas station with every window broken and the pumps torn from their housings. A subdivision entrance where someone had spray-painted "Alive Inside, 4 families. Do not shoot" on a bedsheet hung between 2 mailboxes. And I slowed down and looked, and Cass wrote the location in her journal without being asked. We saw the dead 3 times, twice at a distance. Figures moving across harvested soybean fields in that loose, undirected drift, maybe 8 or 9 of them, following nothing, responding to nothing. Just moving because moving was what they did now, the way wind moves, purposeless, impermanent. Cass watched them through the passenger window with her chin on her hand and said, "They look lonely," which was not an observation I would have made and was not wrong. The 3rd time was close. A single figure standing in the grassy median of Route 53, female wearing a hospital gown that had gone gray with weather and exposure. She turned as we approached. That mechanical rotation, head first, then shoulders. Then the rest of the body following like a machine with a delayed gear train. She watched us pass. Her mouth was moving. No sound reached us through the closed windows, but the movement was rhythmic, almost syllabic, and I accelerated past her and checked the mirror, and she was still turning, still tracking, still mouthing whatever pattern her ruined neurology was cycling through. Cass didn't look away from her until she was out of sight. We reached Marcus's clinic at 2:40 in the afternoon. It was a single-story veterinary practice. Long, low, cinder block construction, flat roofs, surrounded by a perimeter of cattle panels welded together and anchored with T-posts driven into the parking lot asphalt. Crude but functional. Inside the perimeter, the white pickup Dana had driven, 2 other vehicles, a hand-dug fire pit with a cooking grate, and a vegetable garden in raised beds built from dismantled exam tables. The sign on the gate said "Open" in red house paint on a piece of plywood. I'd already described to myself what that sign meant, but seeing it was different from knowing about it. Seeing it after 24 days inside a structure whose every surface communicated closed, sealed, excluded. Mine seeing the word "open" in handmade letters on a plywood scrap wired to a cattle panel hit me somewhere below the ribs, in the place where breath starts before you decide to take it. Patricia examined Cass that afternoon in a room that had been a large animal surgical suite and was now an exam room with a human-scale cot, a blood pressure cuff, and a stethoscope that still had a veterinary supply company logo on the tubing. Patricia was 50-something, short gray hair, reading glasses on a beaded chain, hands that moved with the specific confidence of someone who had touched 10,000 patients and remembered what each one needed before they said it. She reviewed Cass's medication history. She listened to Cass describe the rationing schedule. heard it from Cass's mouth, in Cass's words, with Cass's reasoning laid out plainly and without apology. She didn't flinch. She didn't look at me. She talked to Cass for 40 minutes behind a closed door. I sat in the hallway on a plastic chair that had been designed for a waiting room where people held cats in carriers and dogs on leashes, and I sat there with my hands on my knees, and I did not check any system or any inventory or any binder. I sat with the not knowing. It was the hardest thing I'd done in 24 days, including crossing the yard to Frank's house. When Cass came out, she looked lighter. Not happy, not fixed, not resolved. Lighter, as though something had been lifted from a place I hadn't known was load-bearing, some private architecture of worry and performance and quiet self-management that she'd been maintaining for months, maybe longer than the basement, maybe since she moved in with a father who expressed love through laminated checklists and labeled bins. That evening, I sat on the clinic's front step and watched the sun go down over flat Illinois farmland. The kind of landscape that has no secrets, that shows you everything to the horizon and asks nothing in return. Inside the clinic, 18 people were talking and eating and arguing about water allocation and generator scheduling and whose turn it was to walk the perimeter. And the sound of it. Messy, overlapping, unoptimized, human. Came through the walls and filled the parking lot. Marcus came out and sat beside me and handed me a warm can of Sprite and said nothing for a while. We watched the light go amber and then copper and then gray. The insulin worked, he said. Both patients stabilized. Your neighbor saved 2 lives today. Frank, I said. His name was Frank Reeves. He was a retired pipe fitter. He was 63. He knocked on my door on day 2 and I didn't open it. Marcus drank from his own can. He didn't absolve me. He didn't condemn me. He sat with the fact of it, the way you sit with a heavy thing that belongs to someone else present, willing to hold the silence around it, unwilling to take it away. Frank Reeves saved 2 lives, he said. I drank the Sprite. It was flat and warm and too sweet, and it was given to me by a man who had calculated nothing before handing it over, who had not checked his inventory or consulted a rationing binder or weighed my caloric needs against the supply chain, who had simply seen a person sitting on a step and brought him a drink because that's what people do when they are living instead of surviving. It was the best thing I'd tasted in 24 days. Not because of the sugar, because of the hand. I still have the binders. They sit on a shelf in the room Cass and I share at the clinic, between her stack of borrowed paperbacks and a potted basil plant that Dana grew from seed in a surgical tray. Marcus consults them. Sometimes the medical protocols are genuinely well-researched, he says, and the inventory methodology is better than anything he'd built on his own. The system wasn't the problem. The system was good. I was the problem. The assumption underneath the system. That sufficiency meant closure. That safety meant severance. That love could be expressed in shelf-stable units measured in months and sealed in gamma-lid buckets without ever once requiring the terrifying, unquantifiable, fundamentally uncontrollable act of opening a door to a person you cannot predict. That was the critical failure. Not a missing item, not an overlooked supply, a missing orientation. A preparedness so total it became its own emergency. Cass hasn't had another seizure. Patricia monitors her monthly. Her dosage has been adjusted twice. She reads new books now. Novels and memoirs passed hand to hand through the network. Dog-eared, coffee-stained, untracked by any inventory system, borrowed and returned on no schedule, owned by no one and belonging to everyone. She still has the library book. She keeps it on her nightstand with the barcode facing out, waiting with the stubborn patience of a 16-year-old girl who believes that the world will rebuild itself into a shape that includes a place to return it. I prepared for the zombie outbreak months ahead. I built the walls, I stocked the shelves, I sealed the door. I labeled every bin and laminated every protocol and calculated every variable I could name. And the critical detail I missed was not on any shelf or in any binder. It was sitting on the cot across from me, swallowing half her medication in secret because she had learned from her father that love means rationing yourself for someone else's model. The detail I missed was that survival is not a closed system. The people inside it are not variables to be optimized. And the door you spent 11 months reinforcing has to open from the inside, not because the world outside is safe, but because the world inside, sealed and stocked and labeled and controlled and utterly, perfectly sufficient, becomes the thing you were building against all along.